welcome to episode 116 of the People's History of Ideas podcast. In our last few episodes, we discussed how the communist armies led by Peng Dehuai and Mao Zedong reunited with each other in Ruijin on April 1st, 1929. We also discussed the guidance sent by Zhou Enlai on behalf of the Central Committee to Mao Zedong and Yudu, which reached them shortly after their arrival in Ruijin, and the way in which Mao forcefully and ultimately successfully argued against this guidance in his reply. We also discussed Mao's plan to wage guerrilla war broadly across southern Jiangxi and western Fujian in order to take advantage of the war that had broken out between the Kuomintang and the Guangxi warlords, which meant that Kuomintang armies had left the scene for the moment, ignoring the communists and focusing on what seemed like the greater threat. Mao was so stoked on this war between the Kuomintang and the Guangxi warlords, and the way in which this facilitated the creation of a Soviet area encompassing large parts of southern Jiangxi and western Fujian, that in the autumn of 1929, he wrote a poem called The War Between Chiang Kai-shek and the Guangxi Warlords. It goes like this. A sudden shift in wind and clouds, and the warlords have renewed their conflict, scattering only enmity upon the world. Yet another yellow millet dream is dreamt. Yellow millet dream means something like pipe dream does in English. Red flags have leapt across the Ting River. Just a reminder, Ting River here refers to the conquest of Chongqing, which we discussed in episodes 110 and 111. Straight down to Longyan and Shanghang. Longyan and Shanghang are counties in Fujian which were captured by the communists in May and June 1929. A piece of the Golden Cup has been restored. And here, Golden Cup is a symbol for the territorial integrity of China. Mao and other communists felt that it was only where they were able to set up Soviet areas where some small part of the real China could then shine through. Everywhere else, China had been diminished by imperial domination and the corruption of the Chinese ruling elite in their conception. And then the poem ends with, now we are truly busy sharing out the land. Here, since I had so many clarifying notes on such a short poem, I'll read through it one more time without making any side comments. A sudden shift in wind and clouds, and the warlords have renewed their conflicts, scattering only enmity upon the world. Yet another yellow millet dream is dreamt. Red flags have leapt across the Ting River, straight down to Longyan and Shanghang. A piece of the Golden Cup has been restored. Now we are truly busy sharing out the land. And like I said, this poem was written a few months after we last left off. But before we go back to April 1929 and see what Mao was getting up to, I want to address a question some of you probably have. In hindsight, of course, we know that the communists are going to run Chiang Kai-shek off the mainland of China after another 20 years of nearly constant fighting. But at the time, Chiang didn't know this, or maybe he would have prioritized fighting the communists rather than the Guangxi warlord clique. So, just for comparison's sake, how much more formidable did the Guangxi warlord armies appear to Chiang than the communists' forces in Jiangxi? In a letter that Mao wrote on June 14th, 1929, he gave the number of soldiers in the Fourth Army as somewhat more than 4,000. In contrast, the Guangxi warlords had about 60,000 troops under their command. So even though we know that Chiang Kai-shek is ultimately going to lose to the communists, it does not seem unreasonable, given the troop numbers involved, that the Guangxi warlords seemed the larger threat from Chiang Kai-shek's perspective at the time. Okay, so let's look at what Mao was up to in April, May, and June of 1929. This was a period in which the communists made some rapid advances in establishing their control over parts of southern Jiangxi and western Fujian. But some conflicts that had been brewing within the Communist Party also began to find sharp expression. First, let's talk about the communist expansion, and then, probably next episode, we'll talk about the big conflict that arose between Mao and Yudu. On April 8th, the Red Army left Ruijin and marched west into Yudu. This was the first of several counties that the Red Army would sweep through over the next month, and one of three where it was able to set up a new county-level revolutionary governing authority during that time. In his memoirs, Peng Dehuai remembered the march from Ruijin to Yudu in a way that might help you to think more concretely about what this march looked like on the ground, as well as a political lesson that he took from an interaction with Mao Zedong on the march. All right, in the memoir here, Peng Dehuai has just said that they've left Ruijin on the way to Yudu, and here's where the quote begins. Quote, "On our way, we confiscated the grain of a landlord surnamed Zhou and distributed it among the local poor. Some people, either lackeys of the landlord's clan or some of the people who had been misled, tried to obstruct the distribution of grain. Armed conflict flared up. Landlords in southern Jiangxi province manipulated strife between the clans. Without investigating the incident, a responsible member of the 4th Army headquarters ordered that 2 of the people opposing the distribution be shot. The Red Army was just passing by and did not stay long. It would have been easy for reactionary landlords to take advantage of this incident to stir up armed conflict and obscure class struggle. Army Commander Zhou, Party Representative Mao, and I took our lunch together. At that time, everybody used a towel to wrap up a lump of cooked rice to eat whenever we took a noon rest. We ate the rice cold with only cool water, without any other food. While eating, Chairman Mao learned of the incident and sternly criticized the wanton killing of people. He was so serious that I was very much impressed. I thought his was a good style of work, a correct political approach. This was the second time, the first was in the Jinggang Mountains, he made such a direct impression on me." End quote. On April 11th in Yudu, a big leadership meeting was held where it was decided that Peng Dehuai would lead his troops back to the Jinggangshan in order to help to restore the base area there, and they took off on April 14th. Not long after that, Mao and Zhou led their troops north to take Xingguo, which was not too far south from the Donggu base area. For much of the second half of April, Mao turned his attention to the role that land reform would play in construction of the new Soviet state in southern Jiangxi and western Fujian. He set up a miniature peasant organizing training institute in Xingguo, modeled on the one that previously he had taught at back during the United Front with the Kuomintang in Guangzhou a few years previously. And Mao taught the main courses on peasant organizing and carrying out land reform for a little over 40 cadres. One of the results of this focus was the creation of a land reform law for the new county-level Soviet government. Back in December 1928, Mao had drafted a land law for the Jinggangshan, which was adopted as law there and which reflected how the land reform process there had been carried out. In 1941, in a work that he published, which can be translated as Rural Investigations or Rural Surveys in English, which mainly consisted of a collection of detailed rural investigations that Mao had conducted during the early 1930s, Mao also reviewed the party's history of carrying out land reform and included some comments on the early land laws that he wrote. Mao's comments here give us some insight into the learning process as well as the political compromises that went into these early land laws. Here is what Mao had to say about that first December 1928 Jinggangshan land law. Quote, "This land law was enacted in the winter of 1928 on the Jinggangshan, the Soviet border region of Hunan and Jiangxi. This was the summary of the experience of the land struggle during one whole year, from the winter of 1927 to the winter of 1928. Before this, there had been no experience whatsoever. This land law contained several mistakes. 1. confiscation of all land instead of only the land of landlords. 2, the ownership of the land was vested in the government rather than in the peasants, who had only the right of use. 3, sale and purchase of the land were prohibited. These were all mistakes of principle and were later corrected. As for why it was declared that cultivation in common and using labor power as the criterion for land redistribution should not be used as the primary methods, but that private farming and using the number of people as the criterion for land redistribution should be used as the primary methods. The reason is that at the time, although it was felt that the former method was inappropriate, quite a few comrades advocated it. A decision was therefore taken in this sense, but afterward this was changed and only the latter method was used. The practice of hiring people to farm the land of Red Army personnel was later changed to mobilizing the peasants to farm for them." End quote. So, to highlight a few salient points about this first land law that Mao drafted back in the Jiangxi at the end of 1928, as Mao mentioned in this quote, the perspective taken here was essentially the nationalization of the land by the Soviet government and then its redistribution for use by the peasants. In the Xingguo land law that Mao drafted in April 1929, this was changed to confiscating all public land and all land belonging to landlords. This was the main substantive change made between the December 1928 Jiangxi land law and the April 1929 Xingguo land law, because the communists realized that the peasants were not going to react well to having their land confiscated by the state, even if it was immediately given back to them to use, but not to legally own any longer, and even if that land was now larger because it included land confiscated from landlords. But as Mao mentioned in the quote from 1941 that I read, there were some other important elements to both the Jiangxi and Xingguo land laws that the communists would later sum up as being wrong. One of the most important of these was the issue of whether land should be distributed to the peasants based on how much capacity any given peasant household had to work the land in terms of tools, livestock, and the number of working age people who were in the household, or whether land should be redistributed on a strict per capita basis, with larger households getting more land even if they did not have the same capacity to work the land as a smaller household which had more working age people and good tools and animals for working the land. As we discussed in episode 88, when we talked about how these issues came up during the summer of 1928 land revolution in the Jiangxi, the argument in favor of land distribution, according to the power to work the land, hinged on the fact that it would lead to a more efficient and productive use of the land, which would benefit the overall economy and well-being of the base area. The power to work the land would be determined by some combination of age, gender, and possession of tools and draft animals. That would perhaps be a bit cumbersome to determine, but it made more sense, according to this argument, than giving land to children, the elderly, women with bound feet who couldn't engage in agricultural labor, and so on. The argument in favor of per capita land distribution was principally that this was more egalitarian, with the additional benefit of being administratively much easier than trying to rank everyone according to their ability to work the land and then doling out land amounts of varying sizes according to some sort of power to work the land score. The problem with giving out land to people who couldn't work it was effectively dismissed by advocates of this position by indicating that in practice, children, the elderly, women with bound feet, and whoever else couldn't work the land were almost always connected with people who could work the land. And obviously, these people needed to be fed too, even if they couldn't work. So this wasn't as big of an issue as it was made out to be by the proponents of distributing land according to the power to work the land. But the most important issue for the proponents of per capita land distribution, including Mao, was that distributing land according to the power to work the land would preserve more of the inequality that already prevailed. Even when the better off peasants and small landlords had some or even much of their land taken away, they retained other advantages. They had better tools and seed stock and had more and better draft animals. So the decision to favor per capita land distribution ultimately came down to prioritizing a more egalitarian distribution of land at the expense of what may have been a somewhat better economic outcome for the base area in the short term. It's interesting that here, even at basically the first point where the Chinese Communist Party had to make a decision about how to reshape society in an area that it governed, the contradiction came up between prioritizing economic outcomes and prioritizing egalitarian values and social reconstruction. This would be one of the main contradictions that characterize the policy choices of the entire period of socialist construction that began in 1949 and which engendered conflicts within the Communist Party between partisans of egalitarianism and partisans of development at any cost. As it happened, back during the land reform of the summer of 1928 in the Jiangxi, the land reform was carried out on a per capita basis. But in the law that was passed in December 1928 and also in the April 1929 Xingguo land law, there was a major hedge inserted against the per capita distribution of land. Here's how the relevant section was worded in the Jiangxi land law. Quote, "The quantitative criteria for land redistribution are A, using the number of people as the criterion and redistributing an equal amount of land to men, women, the old, and the young. B, using labor power as the criterion and giving twice as much land to those who can work as to those who cannot. Of the above two criteria, the first is to be the primary one. In places where special circumstances prevail, the second criterion may be applied." End quote. And the Xingguo land law, 4 months later, reused the exact same language. Now, just reading this, you would think that the per capita basis of land redistribution had prevailed, at least as the primary form of redistribution. However, based on what Mao wrote in 1941, and this may have been hard to follow without having the text in front of you, when Mao wrote that, quote, "A decision was therefore taken in this sense," that is, in favor of per capita distribution of land, but afterward this was changed and only the latter method was used, end quote. The latter method of being the distribution according to the power of any given household to work the land, Mao is saying that in practice, then, the insertion of a clause in the land law allowing for the use of labor power to be the criterion for land distribution, quote, "in places where special circumstances prevail," unquote, is going to end up allowing those who favor that as the basis for land distribution to just decide that special circumstances prevail in all circumstances. Anyways, as we can see, 12 years later, Mao is going to sum this up as an error. Now, this way of doing things isn't going to stand unchanged until the collapse of the Jiangxi Soviet. There are going to be some major changes in the land laws of the Jiangxi Soviet over the next few years, but this is where things stood in April 1928, and we'll look at the changes that come down the pipe when we get to them. At the end of April, Mao and Zhou led the army east from Xingguo to take the city of Ningdu. In episode 109, when the Red Army first captured the Ningdu county seat in mid-February, the Kuomintang garrison fled in advance of the Red Army. But now the Red Army encountered a stronger force defending the city. Judah relates some things about the campaign through southern Jiangxi in April and the capture of Ningdu in the biography that Agnes Smedley wrote about him. Quote, "In describing his whirlwind campaign through South Jiangxi, during which he fought the landlord militias and provincial armies, the sociologist in Judah came to the fore. In these regions, he said, the peasants lived in small villages surrounded by crumbling walls in which there was only one gate. Inside these walls were 2 rows of squalid, thatch-roofed mud hovels, bordering a street which became a quagmire in the rainy season. In dry weather, the open gutters on either side of the street were filled with decaying refuse. The dark hovels had 1 door and no windows. Inside, the beds consisted either of pallets of rice straw on the earthen floor, or of boards stretched across trestles and heaped with rice straw, which served both as mattress and covering. Too poor to afford the luxury of covers, the people slept in the only clothing they owned, loose trousers and jackets of many generations of patches. There might be a crude wooden table with benches for family meals. The stove, made of mud, was fed through a vent beneath the iron vat above, which was the only cooking vessel, and fuel was dried grass and twigs gathered from the hillsides by children. Rice bowls were of clay with broken pieces riveted in place. Chopsticks were whittled out of bamboo. The 100-headed landlords, as the peasants called them, lived in the large towns and cities, safely enthroned behind strong walls. Here they acted as officials, judges, juries, and executioners. Commanders of the militias, they used local garrison troops to supervise the reaping of the harvests, lest the peasants bury some of their grain which the landlords claimed as their due. We never had to lay siege to any village, General Zhou said. Whole villages poured out and often walked for miles to wait for us, but the strongholds of the landlords had to be taken by storm. Our miners, whom we had organized into an embryonic engineering corps, would excavate holes in the walls of such towns or cities and fill them with the black powder that the peasants manufacture and sell to make firecrackers. If the explosion failed to blow a hole through which our troops could enter, the peasants would bring bamboo ladders which we used to scale the walls. Often women and children marched along carrying baskets and shoulder poles to clean out the rice bins of the landlords. Our troops would fill their pouches with 3 days' rations of rice, and the peasants would take the rest. Everywhere we left trained men behind to organize and lead the peasants. Smashing east, west, south, north, and south for weeks, Judah finally swept northward against the powerful walled city of Ningdu. He had once taken it without firing a shot, but now it was garrisoned by a whole regiment under a Guomindang officer, Colonel Lei Shining. Colonel Lei was a member of the great landlord militarist family of the nearby Shicheng district, and the head of this family was a general in Chiang Kai-shek's army. Colonel Lei, so the peasants said, had a harem of 30 women, and he had boasted that he would mount the head of the red bandit chieftain Zhu Mao on the walls of Ningdu. Unable to blow up the strong walls of Ningdu, the Red Army laid siege to it. Then the troops took it by assault, going up the long bamboo ladders which the peasants brought and mounted against the walls. Hundreds of red soldiers and many peasants died in that struggle, but the city with its entire garrison was finally taken. In those days, there was no sharply drawn line between military and political work, so that everybody did everything, and Judah's name appeared as a member of the Ningdu Soviet, while peasants in distant villages announced him as chairman of their peasant leagues. Judah was not an individual, a person, but a symbol, a name confused with the Red Army, and Red Army men also often ceased to have individual names, but were addressed by the peasants simply as Mr. Sowei or Mr. Soviet. Wherever we went, General Zhou said, we always opened the prison doors and released prisoners regardless of the charges against them. Crime is a class question, and real criminals were never among those prisoners. Instead, they were always poor men unable to pay their debts or taxes, and those who had been jailed for petty crimes against private property. We always found at least some prisoners who were suspected of belonging to peasant or workers' organizations or to the Communist Party, though most such men had already died or been killed. Those left alive were shackled, and the chains had worn sores in their legs so that they often could not walk at all. All were covered with lice, their hair was long and matted, and many had tuberculosis, heart ailments, or were dying of dysentery or typhoid. The prison keepers furnished no food, which had to be supplied by the families of the victims. The prison authorities kept most of this food themselves, so that the prisoners were like skeletons. Now, Judah goes on here to talk about how he captured the commander of the enemy regiment. So it goes like this. Colonel Lei Shining, commander of the enemy regiment, had changed into civilian clothing and hidden when Ningdu was occupied. He was found, dragged out of his hiding place, and led before Yudu, whose head he had promised to mount on the walls of the city. Considering the man's reputation for sexual prowess, Zhou expected to see a big, beefy Lothario, for a harem of 30 women surely called for physical endurance of a high order. Therefore, when Colonel Lei was escorted into his headquarters between 2 grinning guards, Zhou was struck speechless. Before him stood a little shrimp of a fellow, the smallest man he had ever seen, and now in captivity one of the most craven. "So you're the fellow with 30 concubines who swore to mount my head on the walls of Ningdu," Zhou exclaimed in amazement. A roar of laughter from his staff workers and guards destroyed the last shred of the little man's composure. "Now listen," Zhou said to the little man. "We ought to shoot you, but we won't if you obey our orders. In your home in Fujian are many rifles, machine guns, cases of ammunition, silver, and tons of rice looted from the peasants. You haven't paid your soldiers for 5 months either. You've salted that away also. Now, all of these guns, ammunition, money, and rice shall be delivered to us here, and in addition, we will give you a list of medicine, which will have to be bought in Shanghai or some other big city. Until all of these things are in our hands, you will remain our prisoner. After that, we will set you at liberty." The little turtle, as the Red Army soldiers called him, wrote a letter which one of his soldiers took to his family in Fujian. A few days later, his chief wife came riding into Ningdu in a sedan chair, followed by columns of bearers with everything demanded except the medicine. She spent that night with her husband, but some of Zhou's staff workers laid idle bets that instead of sleeping with him, she gave him a good licking for costing the family so much by allowing himself to be captured. The thing that stumped them, they said, was why she wanted to ransom the fellow at all. 3 months later, when the Red Army was campaigning in Fujian province, the Lei family finally delivered the demanded medical supplies. Zhou had taken Colonel Lei along as a prisoner, but now, in fulfillment of his promise, he gave him a safe conduct pass and released him with the cool remark, "If we catch you a second time, things won't go so easy with you." All right, I think it's interesting that just as with the capture of Chongqing, we have the old PE teacher, Yudu, denigrating the physique of his opposing Kuomintang counterparts, who he's just defeated. But anyways, I'll let the listener decide what that tells us about Yudu or doesn't. So, with the conquest of the Ningdu county seat, the communists proceeded once again to set up institutions of Soviet government in the area, just as they had done earlier in the month in Yudu and Xingguo. In mid-May, the fighting between the Jiangxi warlords and Chiang Kai-shek ended for the time being, and the Kuomintang armies that had been in Jiangxi before that war returned to the area. With the increased pressure from Kuomintang armies in Jiangxi, Mao and Zhou decided to move their main force into western Fujian to continue conquering territory where the Kuomintang was weak. On May 23rd, the Red Army marched in and took the Longyan county seat in Fujian. In this battle, they wiped out a battalion of the local Kuomintang warlords' forces, but in order to lure in his main force, the communists withdrew from the city and marched south and captured the Yongding county seat on May 25th. Then, they returned to Longyan on June 3rd to annihilate the main force of the local Kuomintang warlords' army, which they had lured in with their initial retreat from the city. So, where things stood in early June was that a very large territory stretching from southern Jiangxi through much of western Fujian had been captured over the course of 2 months, and new Soviet institutions set up to carry out land reform and govern these areas. During this period of rapid expansion, as I mentioned earlier in this episode, a major dispute broke out between Mao Zedong and Yudu, which apparently had been brewing for some time. I'll talk some about this next episode. Until then, be well.